Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bilby Watercolor tutorial. So I'm starting out with a pencil sketch, col-erase pencils on 120 pound cold press watercolor paper, and I'm going to use my synthetic squirrel hair mop brush, and I'm just going to lay down a layer of just plain water wherever I'm going to do my first pigment layer. Now with watercolor paintings, you 99.9% of the time want to start light to dark. You have to build them up slowly, usually. There's always exceptions to the rules, but for the most part, you're going to start light to dark. So that's why you see me starting here with the underbelly and around the nose, because the Bilby has a creamy colored underbelly. So now I'm coming in while the water's still, pretty wet on the paper, and I'm coming in with some Naples yellow. That is Daniel Smith Naples yellow. The Naples yellow color varies greatly from brand to brand. I suggest getting a couple and kind of seeing where your preferences lie. Naples yellow from Daniel Smith is a little bit more tan. Some of them are a little bit more pink. So for those who aren't familiar with the bilby, it is a small marsupial in Australia. They're kind of like their equivalent of a rabbit, uh, but sadly enough, they're actually pretty endangered now because of rabbits and people with loose house cats that they, let roam free. They eat seeds, grasses, a lot of insects. They're burrowers, so a lot of burrowing insects, and unfortunately, they compete with the rabbit that was brought over from Europe and let loose. And then they're, easy pickings for cats, unfortunately. So right now, I'm bringing in a little bit more of a deep yellow color, and this, you could pretty much get colors like this mixing a standard palette. I have a ridiculous amount of watercolors. You do not need to have more than, you can get by with most things having 8 to 10 colors. So I'm bringing in just a little bit of a nice vivid red, my bright red from my Cine watercolors, which is, I probably pronounced that terribly wrong because it is French and I am not. It is spelled Sennenelier. So they are not cheap watercolors, but they have a very nice high pigment load. And I'm just resting that. I put that in right in the nose because they have a fairly pinkish nose. And then I'm coming in back in there with that nice deep yellow color and just putting that in a few areas where I want a little bit more warmth to show in. If you'll notice, I'm putting it on the elbow of the front paws or the front arms, and that's largely, to help separate it from the body a little bit. They're very fluffy animals, and you can't necessarily tell their joints terribly well in the picture because it's all lost in the mass of fur. So in that way, you can use, your warmth and saturation of your paints to kind of help give some volume to your creatures. And right now I'm coming in with a little bit of sienna, the quinacridone sienna from Daniel Smith, and I'm just bringing that in. Like I said, they're very tan, creamy undertones, and then what they actually have is like a blue-gray saddle on the back, but it's not like a cold color. It's a little warm, so that's why I'm coming through with the sienna to give it a little bit of a warm underground for that blue-gray to sit on. Now, whenever you see me, not touching the painting for a little bit, that is me going and double checking my reference. You always want to make sure you have reference handy. I have a multi-monitor set up on my desktop, so I always have one monitor covered in various photo references that I'm using. This particular painting we're not going for photorealism. I'm going for, I guess if you were to take a photo and saturate it, pull it into Photoshop or a photo editing program and just up the saturation, this might be more what you'd see. I guess kind of like a toned down Lisa Frank. Which, if you don't know who Lisa Frank is, that might be a good thing. So I'm coming back in and pulling in just a little bit more sienna in a few spots, pulling in a little bit more the Naples yellow. And I'm just warming up a couple of areas that aren't going to get much gray blue on top of them. So I'm setting down like a nice base value there. So now what I'm doing is I'm doing a little quick spot check to see how damp the paper is, because I'm laying down my shadow area or shadow layer now. It's not all going to be in one pass. I'm going to do multiple passes with it, but I always like to use a little bit more of an unusual color for my shadows. So in this case, I'm using a permanent violet, Daniel Smith permanent violet. And I'm just pulling that in wherever the shadows are going to be. You'll notice that the areas where I leave it a little bit more intense are usually around joints, or where, arms or limbs are resting closer to the body, because you'll notice, if you look at a shadow in real life, that the closer an object is to the surface it's casting a shadow, you're going to have a darker, more clean line shadow. And I'm just dropping a little bit of that color in the eyes. I usually save the eyes until pretty much last. But it's always nice to put in just a little bit of a faint color because until you put something in the eyes, they kind of don't have much life to them. It kind of helps you get attached to your painting a little bit. Now you'll notice I leave some of my edges pretty sharp. And I'll come back in and I'll, sometimes I'll leave them sharp if I want a line there, and then other times I'll come back in with either a wet, just with water brush, like right now, and I'll get rid of that hard edge, or I'll come in with a brush that I've cleaned and I've just tamped it dry a little bit on paper towel to the side, and I'll use that to kind of soak up some of the pigment. But I don't always do it right away. That's what you want to do if you made a mistake, obviously. But, sometimes I'll just let paint sit on the paper for a little bit, just to give it a chance to soak in. But I don't want all of the pigment to soak in, which is why I'll come back in and knock some of it back. Now, for the shadows, you may, if you're new to art, your impulse is always to use black or gray. It's one of the first rules you learn in art school is never use black for your shadows. Unless you're a comic book artist, obviously, you're doing your moody Batmans, you don't really want to use black shadows because it's a very, very fast way of just flattening your whole painting out. So unless that's the effect you're going for, you really want to pay attention to your shadows, because what color the lighting source is will affect what color your shadows are, vice versa. It's an entire fascinating thing on color theory. So right there was a little bit of a time skip. I waited a couple of hours, let that base layer of the warm, yellow tones thoroughly dry, and now I'm coming in with a lavender color. It's more blue than lavender, I would say, but it is called the Da Vinci. It's Da Vinci brand's lavender. I actually have another brand that I prefer a little bit more than this. It's Kuretake. It's a Japanese brand, and they call it like periwinkle or cornflower blue. But the only problem with their stuff is that it only comes in big sets of, you know, all these other colors, and unfortunately I just want that blue. So instead of, you know, spending a fortune and getting this whole set that's going to take up even more room in my studio, I hunted down over a very long time and finally found Da Vinci's. Most Da Vinci paints are student intermediate level quality, so I was avoiding them for the longest time, but they do have a professional series now, which is where this color comes from. So right now I'm putting it down wherever the gray saddle area that I mentioned is on their body. So you'll see a lot of what I mentioned about the harsh lines, you know, where I let it soak in for a bit. Because right now it's, you know, it's very like raccoon-like. But obviously in the final painting it's not going to be anything like that. But it's a lot of practice, a lot of getting to learn and understand your watercolors and your paper, and, you know, knowing how long you can let something sit before you have to, you know, clean it up, or, you know, knowing essentially how far you can push the limits of both paint and paper. It just comes down to practice. So I'm going in and knocking back a little bit of that circle around the eye, and I'm just blending it in a little bit. Now you notice I haven't given up on the colors I used in the first wash. I do come back in with a little bit more of the Naples yellow again, just to help blend in this lavender blue that I'm using. And once again, I'm pulling in the siennas. And you'll notice that with the siennas, like I'll lay down that initial clean color where there's definitely warm browner spots on, you know, my reference photos. But what I'm going to be doing is, you can see here, is I'm going to start pulling the sienna down into that lavender. And what it does when you pull it in is it mellows out, you know, it warms up the cool tones, and it kind of evens out to a nice warm gray. Which this is something that takes a bit of practice and getting to know your paints to get here to know that, you know, these two colors are going to interact this way. So I technically did this the bad method of just doing it directly on the painting, but smarter artists will have a nice, they'll have a little scrap piece of paper that they'll plan out the whole painting ahead of time, and they'll do these blends ahead of time on this scrap piece to make sure that this will work out before, you know, doing it straight to the painting. But I live on the edge. So I'm just taking a little bit more, and it's very faint, very soft touches of the sienna that I'm using. It's a very strong pigment, so you don't want to, you know, just get a little bit of water in the palette and just go straight in there and, you know, take that and put it directly to the paper. It's way too strong. So I always have like a very heavily wet brush, wet the paint first, then go in with the wet brush and knock out a lot of the color by, you know, smoothing it out on the edges. So you knock out a little bit of it on your paintbrush and not, you know, you don't hit the paper with such an intense coloring. Because as you notice, like right here, this is a little bit too much color right now in the tail. Like this tail is further back in the background. It does not need to be this warm. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be taking that sienna that is built up too much in the tail, and I'm going to start pulling it into other parts of the body that can use it. So instead of actually going and getting more pigment on my brush, like whenever you see my paintbrush not on the painting here, it's not because I'm getting more paint, it's because I'm actually just cleaning it out and getting more water. Because I'm going to be pulling in are pulling out some of the colors. So I knocked it back a little bit right there with a little bit of the permanent violet again. And now I'm taking that extra pigment that I mixed a little bit on the painting itself, and I'm pulling it back into other parts of the painting that can use it. It would technically be easier and faster to just dab it up with paper towel, but I don't know, it seems almost wasteful, and at this point I've got a nice blend going with this, you know, the little pool of color that needs to be pulled out. So it's not pure anymore. I mixed in the permanent violet, and I'm mixing it in a little bit to the lavender that's still a little bit wet. So it works out better this way for me, at least. So now while the sienna is still wet, I'm going to be pulling in just a little bit more of that lavender, just because I want to knock back some of the warmth in the shadows, and I want to blend in a little bit more where I've noticed in my reference photos I had it a little too warm in the ears, so I'm trying to fix that on the ear tips. So the lavender, I didn't want to use it at this point anymore because it was a little too close to the fur colors. So what I actually am using now is La Aqua Royal Blue watercolors. And that's another one that's a very strong pigment, so it's a very light touch. And even, you know, heavily diluted, it was too much, so that's why you see me laying it down and then dabbing it up with paper towel. Now, you might be inclined to not use paper towel because, you know, it is paper usage in a world where we're trying to avoid one-use objects or items and stuff, but I have tried using rags and I've tried using sponges, and they just don't have the same effects, so I still stick to paper towels. I just use them until there's nothing left. So now I'm coming in, and this is a little bit of the quinacridone purple. I'm probably pronouncing that terribly wrong. It's another Daniel Smith one. And so there's areas on the Bilby where there's a little bit darker patches of fur, specifically in between the eyes and a little bit on the shoulders and the tail leading up to the white tip. So I'm pulling in a little bit more of this dark, warm purple color. And I always want to try and balance it out, you know, before you go too strong in one color. I'm pulling in the lavender once again. It's a balancing act, is watercolor paintings. And so since all this is done pretty much on, you know, 90% of this painting is wet right now, it's a constant blending that's happening here. And you have to really pay attention, because, you know, sometimes pigments will start layering in an area, or they'll pool in an area because your paper is buckling, and you just have to keep an eye out for that, because if not, you might end up with like a weird line going on that you didn't want. One way to avoid that is to stretch your watercolor paper, and by that I mean you can stretch by taking the paper, wetting it before you paint anything, putting it down on a board, and either taping or stapling it down and letting it dry. And that usually keeps the paper pretty flat. But I tend to keep that for pieces that I know I'm going to be doing like a full, you know, the whole entire paper is going to be covered in paint. I need it to last me a long time, you know, full illustrative pieces, then I'll stretch it. But for a little one-off one like this that's fairly loose, it's not necessary, at least not in my mind. It does come down to paper quality, though. You want a nice, heavier weight paper to be able to handle it. So essentially this is a lot of just balancing of pulling in that dark warm purple and pulling in that lavender blue, and sometimes a little bit of sienna and a little bit of the Naples, and just trying to get the right tones. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't quite work out and you gotta dab it up with a paper towel. It happens. Now, if you ever see me, like, taking the paintbrush and rolling it a little bit, it's another thing that comes with practice. It's feeling the weight of the brush and knowing where the most, you know, water is being held in it. So it just comes down to, once you do enough paintings, you'll be able to feel that naturally. And so you'll know how to, you know, rotate your paintbrush to get the point that you need for the particular area you're painting. This brush that I'm using is, you know, obviously one of my favorites, and it's because it has both the ability to hold a lot of pigment and it has a bit of a tip. Not like a super fine tip, but well, you know, with enough experience, you can figure out how to rotate it just right to get fairly close to hair-like textures. And you know, sometimes it's like the whole technique is almost like a flick of the wrist kind of a thing. So it's just, don't be mad if you can't do it right away. It's totally fine to have, you know, a whole plethora of paintbrushes from, you know, thick to thin to suit your needs. With experience, you know, you'll probably find a favorite like I do, and it's different from person to person. Some people like, you know, fan brushes or square brushes. I just happen to like my little oval round mop. So I'm coming back in again, a little bit of the permanent violet once again, and I'm just sharpening up some of those shadows that I did in the first round that have been knocked back a little bit. And it's keeping the shadows on par saturation wise with the rest of the painting. So I let the shadow, the hard edge, sit there a little bit, soak in just a little bit, and then I come in with just plain water on my brush and I pull back a little bit of the intensity. But you'll notice I just blended out one edge because I want that other edge, that more sharper edge, to be left in there, because that's showing, you know, that the front arm is pulling in closer to the body there. So this just comes down to studying things in 3 dimensions. This is how you'll figure out, you know, where shadows will lie on a painting that you're doing in 2D format. This is where life drawing comes into effect, essentially. So right now I'm using a little bit of the lavender and a little bit of the royal blue to knock back the tail a little bit. My lighting scenario that I have in my head for this means that objects further away should be a little cooler, which is one of the reasons why the head and that front limb reaching out are a bit warmer than the rest of the body. So you'll notice that if you watch me painting now versus in the beginning of the video, that I'm starting to use more of the tip of my brush, and that's how I get a little bit more of the hair-like textures in there. And it's not like completely fur texture happening right now. I'm also knocking back a lot of the edges that are starting to come in from the cooler layer that I did in the shadows. So for a creature like this, or for painting like this, you know, it's a very fluffy animal, and you might be inclined to go and do a ton of fur textures, but that's kind of one of the signs of a beginning artist, is too many details. So you see me rotating the brush right there to figure out the weight, and I'm trying to get that point that I need to do. Not like fine lines, but just a little bit of like chunky lines to kind of give, you know, the impression of fur without going crazy and doing hair by hair detail. So the problem with doing, a bunch of detail is that it is very easy to lose your entire piece. Like, there will be no focal point because there's just detail everywhere. And so that's a problem with, like, first time, beginning illustrators, when they're doing something furry, they want to draw all the fur or they want to do all the scales. And it's not only vastly more time consuming, but it's just so much harder to follow. So it kind of comes down to figuring out where you want the more details in there. So what I usually do for my technique is, you can see it in the sketch, I'll save it for areas where the fur changes in pattern movements or bunches up a bit more. It's accentuating the limb. Now on the tail right here, you might be thinking that I'm adding in black. That is Lunar Violet. That's a Daniel Smith Lunar Violet. And it is a very dark, desaturated purple color. So it's kind of like as close to black as you can get without actually being black. So this is something that you learn, it's an art school practice to be given a bunch of paints and be told to, like, make a black with these, blues and reds, and without actually forming black. So usually it is some form of purple, because you get like a really dark purple and a really dark blue and a really dark red, and together you'll get a really dark purple. And that's typically the kind of black that you will see in a painting is more of that. So I'm just using that to accentuate that there is a spot on a Bilby tail that is definitely black, but I don't want to do that in this painting because of the flattening I mentioned earlier. So I added in a little bit more of the permanent violet up around the eye and around the nostril, and you want to be careful and do that while they're dry so it's not fanning out. And I'm coming in now with a new brush, and this actually isn't the greatest brush that I'm using right now. I thought it was one of my Da Vinci Sables, and it is not. I think it's actually one of my partner's mini painting brushes, so I was not pleased with it. But with a watercolor painting, you only have so much time where everything's dried out, so I just had to kind of deal with it and go. So you want something with a nice tapered point to it, range color or number-wise from like a 0 to a 2. And I'm pulling in just a little bit of magenta or like a opera rose in there. Magenta actually isn't a color, but that is a whole different topic for later. And I'm using that to I'm using the opera rose, the brighter pink colors, to give a little bit of accents to the eyes, and also accentuate some of the inner ear, because the inner ear is where the blood vessels are closest to the skin, so it's a little bit warmer tones in there. Now their eyes obviously aren't purple. I would love if they were, but they're very typical brown, dark brown black. But with this Lisa Frank-esque watercolor series, I've been doing a lot of magenta purple eyes because I like them that way. So I'm coming in with a little bit more. This is the dark purple again, and I'm using it to just very watered down version. I'm using it to make a little bit more refined edges where there are definite shadow shapes you need to define, and to show where the whiskers are coming from. Bilbies have a lot of whiskers. They've got like 5 rows. Their whole upper lip, essentially up to the very top, is rows of whiskers. And I'm pulling in a little bit more of the permanent violet back into the shadows again. You'll notice that, like, compared to the first layer of shadow work that I did versus this one, the shadows have definitely been the manifest destiny more and more of the body. And that's gonna happen. It's planned out that way because you'll see where I did the first coat, there's a lot more build-up and a lot more intense shadowing. So now I'm going through, and now that it's had a little time to dry, I'm going in and adding more details to the eyes. I always have this problem where I rush the eyes because they're the last part that I do, and I want to get done with the painting so bad. So I'll rush the eyes, and there'll be just a little bit of damp around it, and they just blossom out. Like they'll just hit that little bit of dampness, and they'll just mushroom out onto the painting. And then, of course, I'm stuck madly dabbing away with paper towel trying to get rid of it. So this is where patience is a virtue. So now what I did, I went and got some of my white acrylic ink. So acrylic, obviously, as a different, not water-based paint, can layer on top of watercolors. So I like to use it for areas like right there where I had some fur detail in the initial sketch and it got lost in all the shadow layers in the ear. So I put it back in there just very faintly with a little bit of the white acrylic ink, and then I blended it in with just, a watered down brush. And I wanted to add a little bit more pink to the nose, so I came in there once again with that bright red that I had in the Senae ones. And I'm gotta let it dry a little bit, and then I will come back with a little bit more of the white ink. And now I'm adding highlights to the claws. Bilby's actually have 5 front claws, but they've only got the digging claws on the 3 middle ones. So I'll use that to add, I'm just doing a little bit of like fur texture in the painting along the outer edge. It's like adding a gloss sunlight spot. You can't necessarily tell until you see it in real life though, so it's kind of a treat, I guess, for people that see a painting live to see like the little things that don't scan in. And I'm using that white ink to accentuate the shape of their muzzle a little bit more. They have like a big overbite, so that tip of the nose, there's no bottom jaw there. It's just this fleshy little snout. So there's actually quite a round part on the bottom that's a little hard to show in a painting. So I'm just using a little bit of the white ink to kind of like put a little bit of that roundness in there. And now it's just essentially final details. It's knocking in a little bit more shadows, going in and adding mostly fur details at this point. And like I said earlier, you don't want to be too crazy. I'm taking a little bit of, this is like a more fleshy pink color. I think it's my Koi brand Pale Orange. It's not really orange. Like I said, it's like a warm fleshy pink. And I'm just using that to blend in a few more areas that are a little too pure white, and to start adding in some of the fur details. So for doing fur, it's usually a 2-step kind of thing. I'll take one layer. The first layer will be with a little bit more pigment, and I'll put down the line work, and then I'll clean the brush and just come back with a little bit of water and then blend in those fur strokes. So right there you see I'm knocking back a little bit of the white ring around the eyes. I actually preferred the white ring there, but it was not in the reference as much as I wanted it to be. I enjoyed it because it brought your focal point to the eye a little bit more. But I didn't want to be that far off reference, so I knocked it back a little bit. And we'll pull it back a little bit more by adding in these fur details around there. So now it's just, this is very diluted, back down to that quinacridone purple. Sometimes a little bit of the permanent violet, depending on which section. essentially just a warm, darker purple, and I'm just using a very diluted mixture of that to do essentially the end of hair tufts, and then I blend it in with water. So at this point what I'm just doing is I'm coming in and following my reference a bit with the diluted dark purple and adding in some darker hairs along the back and around the back haunches and the shoulder blades. It's not my personal preference to put darker hairs back there. If it were up to me, I'd probably do something a little more around the face, but since this is following reference, I wanted to, you know, stick fairly close to the From Life examples. So it's just a lot of, once again, that's very diluted colors. Like in my palette, I'm not actually touching the paint itself right now. I'm just, there's enough water in the palette with a little bit of pigment mixed in, and I'm sampling from that. And you notice that my fur, you know, isn't randomly put down. You follow from, you know, if you have reference photos, you should always have reference photos. Try to get some up close so you can see fur patterns. Or, you know, best thing is study from life wherever possible. You know, if you got a cat or a dog, look at which direction their fur grows in, and that will help you out, because it definitely follows a pattern and everything, and you know, there's little swirls and whirls where it mixes in. And my very last step is I take that white acrylic ink and I add one little spot, or two spots in the eyes, one big one, one little one. And there's our final scanned in painting. So thank you for watching my video. Hopefully it wasn't too long, and hopefully you learned something. Thank you. Bye-bye.